Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I've looked on and followed with great interest the work of the Council and the Circle, and so it's really exciting to be here. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much. And in a double act with Gary, when we were both asked, we were saying, well, what should we do? How will we divvy it up in this? Well, our challenge is to think of a gender equal economy. That's part of a UK commission that I'm part of and that we would encourage you all to be part of as well. So that was a challenge set for Gary. Let's talk about how we vision a gender equal economy, and I think Gary's given us some clear tips there. I also have slides which will be impossible to see, so we'll just ignore them for the most part, and I'll talk through it. I'll also try and however, stick to the script that goes with the slides. Otherwise, as those of you who know me know that I will go off script straight away. And I've only got 20 minutes, so I'll crack on. Oh, hello. Lots of new known faces in the audience. It's lovely. Gender budgeting. What's gender budgeting? Policy coherence. I think the two go really well together. Because if policy coherence is about trying to ensure from a gendered perspective, from an equalities perspective, from an outcomes perspective, a democratic, non-discriminatory, non-disadvantaged perspective, then we need a coherence of vision, a coherence of values across how policy and how public finance attached to that policy are formulated, how we scrutinise those processes, how we inform those processes. And we've already heard about the need for some training and capacity building. For years I've been talking about the need to build the confidence and competence of our policy officials, because we're asking them to think differently. And we come across this all the time, that we're asking colleagues in the transport world to think about equalities. We're asking colleagues in energy, in fisheries, in harbour maintenance to think about equalities, and they go, oh, but that's not what we do. The Equality Unit does that, or the social justice folk do that. No, they don't. Sometimes they actually don't, but they don't. I'm not going to give a talk on mainstreaming. I'm going to give a talk on policy coherence, because it makes sense. It is a coherent way to think about what kind of society do we want? What kind of Scotland do we want? And if we take that from an approach of what do we value? Do we value care? Do we value the contribution of care? Do we value the act of caring, the provision of caring? Do we value non-discrimination? Do we value non-disadvantage and people living a life that is free from discrimination and disadvantage? Well, if those are our starting points, then they have to be prevalent all the way through. They have to be part of our thinking through whatever policy area we're engaged in. And gender budgeting, I think, is a tool for that policy coherence, because it says budgets, public finance are not something that are remote and out of reach and are somehow or other, if not a secret, but a removed or elite part of policy making. They're absolutely central. It's our money. It's our taxes. It's our outcomes. It's outcomes for our society, our communities, our families that we're looking to realise with these public finance decisions. So bringing a gender lens to how policy is formulated and to how resource allocations, so how we raise and spend our money, how those decisions affect people's different lived experiences, is the coherence that we're looking for. So gender budgeting as an idea started about 30 years or so ago, longer actually. It started in the 1980s in Australia. I'm off script already, sorry. But just a quick historic update. Started in the 80s in Australia, not at the national level, but at the state level, where they had women's budgets. So they were trying some gendered analysis of spend at that time. As with many attempts of policy innovation and policy change, they're vulnerable to the electoral cycle and change in political parties. and the whims of politicians, let's be frank. And so gender budgeting kind of fell away then, but came back through in the 1995 conference, the fourth World Conference on Women, the whole idea of gender mainstreaming, and there was enough women talking about gender budgeting to sneak in some stuff on public finance into the platform for action. And that's when Scotland started to get involved, because 1999, devolution, new way of doing things, enough disruption in the political system. We were talking about this on the way through on the train with Gary and Eamon. I was saying there was enough disruption in the political system, created an opportunity there. The doors were open, so we kind of wedged them open with this idea of gender budgeting, doing something differently. We have a new budget, we have a new government in Scotland, a new budget process. So let's do something different. And that's how the Scottish Women's Budget Group was formed, with my dearly and sadly missed colleague Ailsa Mackay, myself, Fiona Forsyth from Glasgow City Council, Anne Henderson, Maura Gillespie, lots of women, lots of good social movements, lots of chat around a kitchen table, sometimes a few chats in the pub, and we pushed hard on this idea of gender budgeting, using the resources and networks that we had, who was working where, who was maybe involved in what political party, who was maybe involved in what trade union, building that momentum, quite often going into committees where we were talking, encouraging the new politicians to think about gender budgeting, and they're going, oh, it's a very interesting idea. What do you know about it? And we're going, oh, we know loads about it, because we read it up last night. Because it was really quite fast moving, and it was a very new idea at the time. That was 20 years ago. We've had 20 years of trying to embed this process in Scotland. We're the only part of the UK that has an equality budget statement. We're the only part of the UK that has the Equality Budgets Advisory Group that brings together the Office of the Chief Economist, the statisticians, the National Performance Framework colleagues, finance colleagues, and colleagues from outside government. It's a very unusual structure that I have the privilege now of chairing. We have colleagues from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, from Scottish Women's Budget Group, the Audit Scotland now, and the Scottish Human Rights Commission and COSLA. So a range of interests there across public finance. So we function as a kind of partly a scrutiny, partly a knowledge exchange and practice exchange body, but all directed, poor things, but at shifting some of the practice of the officials within Scottish Government, within the process. It's that systems change that we're trying to deliver. So that's the contextual and historical analysis over with. So what is gender budgeting? Firstly, it challenges the assumptions that budgets are gender neutral. Oops. This is counterintuitive, this we differ. That's why we're all making the same mistake. So, gender neutral. Oh, what does finance have to do with gender equality? You blooming feminists, you want to get into everything. Well, yes, we do actually, because it all matters. Budgets are not gender neutral. How finance decisions are made affects all our lives. Where governments decide to put our money affects all our lives. And our lives are gendered. Our lives are structured by all sorts of constraints and opportunities that are gendered. So budgets are not gender neutral, and I'll come on to some examples of very clearly where they're not gender neutral. So gender budgeting looks across the budget, and you don't have to be, don't tell anybody, she says to a room of 200 people, don't tell anybody, but I don't really do the numbers. I do kind of, but you know, and Ailsa used to say this as well, she tells stories, not numbers. So I look at the policy process, but what I'm trying to say is budgets, reading the budget doesn't have to be difficult, and that's quite often what happens, and particularly when we go, oh, don't really know about that budgeting stuff, that's not really for me, that's quite tricky. It's not, because we know what we're looking for. We're looking to see, are the decisions that are being made going to make a difference to women's lives? Are the decisions that are being made going to make a difference to women and men's lives and those gender relations? And if not, why not? You've said here in government, these are your objectives. Has that followed through in the finance commitments? That's what we're doing in gender budgeting. So it examines the allocation of public resources and suggests alternative distributions, redistributing resources in such a way that resources will advance equality between women and men. Uses a range of tools, gender impact assessment, equality impact assessment, policy analysis, looking at all sorts of tools, beneficiary analysis, who's going to benefit from this, what's the incidence of the policy problem, if you like. So who is it we're trying to target with this resource, and are these resources being effectively directed towards that issue that government are trying to resolve. But it also, as Gary has been talking about, this approach from a feminist economics perspective challenges established economic models with the aim of eliminating discriminatory outcomes. Gender budgeting is one of the ways in which feminist economics and feminist policy making can break what's been called the strategic silence. We don't talk about women, we don't talk about gender in economics. Isabel Baker coined this phrase in 1994 when talking about the failure of traditional economic models and economic thinking, the failure to recognise the gendered dimensions of economic and public policy, which reinforces women's silence and women's exclusion from formal policy making. So, another slide that you won't see, you might see a little bit. If all else fails, go to Snoopy. And the lessons, who would have thought Charles Schulz was so insightful all those years ago, 1979 this cartoon is from. Don't think Charles Schulz was maybe aware, maybe he was very aware that what he was doing in this cartoon is gender budgeting. So Peppermint Patty and Trusty Marcia come across Linus and his football in the first square. Peppermint Patty says, "That's a nice football you have there, Linus." Marcia, ever faithful, ever at the ready, says, "Shall I give him the statistics, sir?" In 1978, the average budget for intercollegiate athletics for men was 717,000. For women, it was only 141,000. And Linus is crushed, because he's just thinking about his football. But what Marcia has done with her statistics is say public finance is unequally distributed, and the outcomes are not equal. And we see that in much more serious ways on a daily basis with the policy and political decisions that are made. I'm going to show you, and these slides will be available to everybody. So what's on the next few slides is some data from the UK Women's Budget Group, looking at the cumulative effects of changes to the social security system at the UK level and changes to taxation, and the impacts those changes have had across our society. These political decisions, the politically driven choices of austerity, have had an effect, the worst effect, on the poorest in our society. But not only that, within the poorest in our society, Black and Asian women have been the worst affected, losing up to almost 20% of their income from Asian women in between 2010 and 2020. Because, of course, the natural thing to do when faced with an international financial crisis is to go to the root of that crisis, which was clearly family benefits and disability benefits, because that obviously was the source and cause of the crisis. So not only have those benefits been removed from families, but they have been funded. The tax changes have benefited the richest, the top third. But even within that, those changes, women are still worse off. So even when they're better off, even when people are better off, women are still worse off. And women of colour and disabled women continue to be worse off. You'd think I'd have learned by now how to work the differ. So what we're looking at here is families with a disabled child or a disabled adult are particularly badly affected. And worst of all are disabled adults with disabled children in the household, losing up to 18% of their net income. 38% of households include a disabled person, but the cuts that have been made at the UK government level amount to some 71% of that being drawn from households with a disabled adult. Households with a disabled child and a disabled adult losing about £8,000 of annual income. So this is where the examination of policy and resourcing decisions come together through gender budgeting. So households with a disabled child are set to lose twice as much as households with non-disabled children. But in terms of policy coherence, is anybody thinking, what about all this narrative about hardworking families? Families first. Where's the coherence in that when these are the outcomes of decisions? And for women, single women-headed households, lone mother families, they're even worse affected, losing up to over 30% of their income of a lone parent, a lone woman parent with a disabled child in the household. Just over £10,500 per year. So this is why we need gender budget analysis, why we need gender budgeting, and why we need to think about gender budgeting as feminist policy change. What's feminist policy change? It's having a gendered lens, it's being rooted in feminist transformative principles, that idea of systems change, because we need to change the system. We need to change the system that maintains women's silence and invisibility in our economic policies and practices. That result in economic hierarchies, in paid employment, that result in the hierarchies of representation of where women and men are in their decision-making processes. What is feminist policy change? It looks at what happens within the household, it looks what happens within the workplace, it looks what happens in our cultural life and our political life. And focuses on the structures that affect women and men, the structure of the family, the structure of our civil and criminal justice system, those structures that reinforce gendered roles and seek to break down those kinds of policies that discriminate against women for being women. And I'm going to come on to the classic example of that, which is the rape clause. But it also seeks to break down policies that target unequal distribution of resources and the sexual division of labour. So policies around care, around employability, and around skills. These are the types of policies we need to address, and we need to do this from a perspective of using a feminist economics lens, saying that rational economic man, the standard economic models, the measure. Gary started with the mantra that he's trying to deconstruct, which is what we measure matters. We measure what matters. What we need to do is make women count, make women visible, make women's unpaid contribution to the so-called productive economy visible. We need to value care, and care provision is at the centre of a feminist economics analysis. We need to think about what we value as a society and as a country, and have a collective and coherent approach to sustaining that analysis all the way through. And that means we need to include and make visible the non-market and informal economy as part of this system's change. So gender budgeting, I want to say to you, is a tool for policy coherence. It's a whole systems approach to policy making, and it should result in a fairer and more equal distribution of public resources and outcomes for women and men and boys and girls. It's not separate budgets for women and men, and it's not having special projects for women and men. A couple of people who, renowned scholars of public finance and public institutions, Hugh Heclo and Aaron Wildavsky, not known as radical feminists by any stretch, but they did a fascinating piece of work in the late 70s that came out in a book in 1981 called The Private Government of Public Money. I just love that title, because that's what it's all about. And they said, almost like Henry Higgins and Colonel Pickering, when you read this book, because they talk about the great men of the Treasury, and it's like imagining Higgins and Pickering sitting around the fireside calling for Eliza to bring their slippers, as they talk about these great Treasury men. But what they say is really, really pertinent. Surely little the state does is more important than constantly using so much of the nation's work and wealth. Few other governmental activities so consistently affect the lives of everyday citizens. So that, my friends, is why gender budgeting and a gender analysis of budgets is absolutely a legitimate and relevant approach to policy coherence. And it might help us in the future avoid some of the incoherences that we see, like the UK government's rate clause introduced as a cap on child benefit. It might help some of the inbuilt bias in the modern apprenticeship system in Scotland with age limits on restricting access to modern apprenticeships to up to 25 years of age, which has a huge effect on women's participation in the modern apprenticeship programme. Women with families, particularly maybe migrant women who have come to this country and are looking to increase their skills or to have their skills and qualifications recognised. The restrictions in further education funding in Scotland have had a huge effect on women's participation in further education. There's an inconsistency there with the narrative about access to education and a privileging of higher education. We have world-leading legislation on violence against women and girls. That's one of the areas where we need to do another thing that gender budgeting does, which is follow the money. Are the resources in place to really activate what that legislation is trying to do? The reduction in spending, particularly through local authorities, has affected women as workers employed in local authorities, and has particularly affected women as services have been withdrawn and women have withdrawn from formal paid employment. We've seen a huge increase in the numbers of women working part-time, and we need to better understand and resist some of the reasons why that has happened. And as Scotland moves into a delivery of social security entitlement in Scotland, we need to work really hard and to get a lot better at the kind of equality analysis that is informing the delivery and formulation of that policy. So some quick points to finish on. What can we do to improve gender budget analysis in Scotland? We need to build women's knowledge and engagement through the Circle, through the Scottish Women's Budget Group and other women's organisations. We need to push harder, and this is part of my job, to push harder through the Equality Budgets Advisory Group to make the linkages between the Programme for Government, the National Performance Framework and the budget much more explicit, and to have far better processes that improve the quality of analysis that goes into formulation and allocation of resources. Gender budgeting should be a focus in the What Works Institute that the Advisory Council have proposed. I think we need a gender equality strategy for Scotland. And I think at the practical level inside government, there needs to be a very significant improvement in equality impact assessment and gender analysis, the gender competence that Louise was talking about. So we need better processes that bring a better gendered lens to policy making, and that includes revenue raising, includes taxation. Apparently nobody likes to talk about taxation. I love talking about tax, and we need to talk about tax an awful lot more if we're going to address some of the challenges of inclusive and economic growth. And we need to maximise existing levers, but we need to fulfil our human rights requirements as well. We need to maximise available resources for the progressive realisation of rights. And these are all that, everything I've been talking about are questions of human rights, and that a gender analysis to public finance and public policy brings that coherence that should advance and should secure our economic and social rights. So on that, I'm going to finish. Thanks very much.